Thank you for joining me. I'm your host, Marcus Cage, and this is what I've been thinking with Marcus J. Cage. In this episode, or in these couple of videos, which I'm going to drop for you today, I'm going to be going into Vice President Joseph Biden. I'm going to go into his record over the years, some of the controversial things. I'll even mix it up and throw a little bit of humor in there, some of his more benign, funny moments, lighthearted moments. But I'm going to also put in some serious, hard-hitting things about his record, which I feel that should be considered in this whole electability argument with Joe Biden beating President Donald Trump. Personally, I have a lot of reasons why I do not support him, and you will see it in many of these videos, which I'll, in many of these clips in the videos that I'll upload. But overall, I just want to be able to put this information out there for you and let you be able to make the assessment on the electability argument for Joe Biden. If you feel he can beat Trump, if you feel that you are okay with the things which he's done in his record, which aren't necessarily up to par, are things that most politicians would be proud of. Biden, on the other hand, which is different from a lot of politicians that might be embarrassed of some of these things, Joe Biden in a lot of ways is just like Trump. Joe Biden does not like to admit to his faults, and he doesn't like to go back on them. And for him, it's a lot easier for him to just go forward and lie about it and hope that he can move forward than to actually go back and atone for his mistakes. And so in these clips that I'm going to release today, I just want to kind of go over some of the things which I felt were eye-popping and impactful, which I've learned of Joseph Biden over the years. And hopefully you enjoy.
Of the United States, Joe Biden.
It's June 9th, 1987, and then Senator Joseph R. Biden Jr. has just entered the presidential race. Look familiar? The 2020 race is Biden's third attempt at the Oval Office. He first ran for president 32 years ago. For those who may have forgotten or weren't around in '87, here's what happened. Biden started off as a strong contender.
Senator Joseph R. Biden Jr. of Delaware.
But his campaign was marred by some early blunders, like this one.
What law school did you attend, and where did you place in that class? And the other question is...
I think I probably have a much higher IQ than you do, I suspect.
And he exaggerated his academic record in law school.
Went back to law school, and in fact ended up in the top half of my class.
And then there were moments like this, repeated later during the campaign.
When I marched in the civil rights movement, I marched with tens of thousands of others to change attitudes.
But he never actually marched in the civil rights movement at all. Ultimately, it was accusations of plagiarism in his speeches.
I did not know that was a Robert Kennedy quote. My mistake.
That forced him to drop out of the race.
I made some mistakes.
After that, Biden stayed in the Senate, ran again in the 2008 race, became the vice presidential nominee, and then the vice president. Laid low for a little while, and now we're here.
If I'm going to be able to beat Donald Trump in 2020, it's going to happen here.
And certain things, including a handful of Biden's vulnerabilities, haven't changed. He's still leaning into some of the core messages he highlighted during his first presidential run, often emphasizing his profile over policy, promising to put the country on the right path after what he sees as the ills of Republican administrations. Here he is in 1987.
I tell you today that America is a nation at risk.
In 2007.
This president is going to be judged and his administration judged very harshly by history.
And in 2019.
We're in the battle for the soul of this nation.
But Biden has struggled to project himself as a man in step with the times, and parts of his political history continue to haunt him, like his role in the questioning of Anita Hill in 1991.
It is appropriate to ask Professor Hill anything any member wishes to ask her to plumb the depths of her credibility.
And more recently, it was his relationship with personal space.
The boundaries of protecting personal space have been reset, and I get it.
Throughout his more than 4-decade-long career in politics, Biden has become known for his freewheeling charm and authenticity.
I've been referred to as middle-class Joe. It's not always meant as a compliment.
But his candor has also gotten him into some trouble.
I've done some dumb things, and I'll do dumb things again.
As the Democratic frontrunner, Biden will be under a microscope. The question is whether he can harness the folksy appeal he's become known for without repeating the mistakes of the past.
But this standard is not a measure of how we can evaluate the condition of our society. It cannot measure the health of our children, the quality of our education, the joy of their play.
If the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play,
let us pledge that our generation of Americans will pay any price, bear any burden, accept any challenge, and meet any hardship to secure the blessings of prosperity and the promise of opportunity for our children.
we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
And I started thinking as I was coming over here, why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to a university?
Why am I the first kid in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college?
Why is Gladys the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
No, it's not because they weren't as smart. It's not because they didn't work as hard. It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
Does anybody really think that they didn't get what we had because they didn't have the talent or the strength or the endurance or the commitment? Of course not. It was because there was no platform upon which they could stand.
Should the federal government subsidize political campaigns and limit individual contributions? If you were to set out to create a country in which you would have one man, one vote, free speech guaranteed to everybody, and then you'd have candidacies in which one side would be able to spend $22 million and the other side $500,000, you'd realize that that kind of democracy was a hoax. Nobody would even argue about it. Yet those instances in our society have become frequent, and the fact that they don't always occur doesn't mean that they're right when they do occur. What we're proposing tonight is that there be a way in which everybody, even if they're not born rich, have a fair chance to be elected to public office. Today in the United States, 90% of the political contributions come from 1% of the population. And what we hope we can do is to amend the law so that there will be a guarantee that people will have access to funds so they can run if they have enough support to merit it. And then to put a limit on how much any one individual can give so nobody can purchase through wealth an undue share in the decision-making process. To start the testimony for the evening, I call Senator Biden of Delaware. Senator Biden, welcome to the Advocates.
Thank you. Good to be here. Senator Biden, it's nice to have you here. As the youngest member of the Senate, the one, therefore, who may expect the longest career there, I wonder if you'd say to us, since it's clear that you're not corrupt and you got elected, why should people think that the system produces corrupt results when there you are?
Well, I'm not sure you should assume I'm not corrupt, but thank you for that, though. The system does produce corruption, and I think implicit in the system is corruption, when in fact, whether or not you can run for public office, and it costs a great deal of money to run for the United States Senate, even for a small state like Delaware, you have to go to those people who have money, and they always want something.
Well, I wonder whether you would feel that there's some virtue in forcing candidates to go out and try to raise money. I've heard people, probably people who didn't run for office, say that it's uplifting to go out and try to get money. Do you think that there's something unuplifting about putting a limit to how much you can ask one man to give you?
I think it's the most degrading experience in the world to have to go out and ask for money, because you know that unless you accidentally agree with the position taken by the person or group that has the money, that you run the risk of deciding whether or not you're going to prostitute yourself to give the answer you know they want to hear in order to get funded to run for that office. And it's coincidental in many instances when in fact you happen to agree with where they are. And you run the risk, by the way, of rationalizing, of saying, well, if I compromise on this one, give them one, I get 90% of what I want, and I don't have to give in too much.
So you feel it's a difficult temptation, not only for the candidate, not only for the people who give the money, but for the people trying to raise it.
Well, you know, we're told that we politicians, as the young kids say, rip off the American public. I think the American public, in a way, rips off we politicians by forcing us to run the way they do. To raise $300,000 is no mean feat. And unless you happen to be some sort of anomaly, like myself, being a 29-year-old candidate and can attract some attention beyond your own state, it's very difficult to raise that money from a large group of people.
Well, now, some people who agree with the problem, or our definition of the problem, turn around and say, if you just had full disclosure, that would solve it. Do you think that would have a major effect on the problems you're describing?
I think full disclosure is essential. We have that now, allegedly. But that's not going to get to the question of how you have to raise the money and the influence of those who come forward with the money, whether they be a labor union or a corporate executive.
Well, if we put a limit on what individuals can give, and if we have public assistance for candidates, do you think that would work, as some have suggested, to make incumbency even more powerful, that there'd be no way then that challengers could succeed?
No, I don't, but I do think you run the risk in limiting the amount that can be spent of continuing the tyranny of the incumbent. For example, I'm on this show for one reason. I'm an incumbent United States Senator. Were this an election year, this would be allegedly votes for me back home. A challenger of mine would have to pay a great deal of money to get this kind of TV time. We have a lot going for us when we're incumbents, and we use it.
Well, but this process that we're suggesting tonight, in your view, would not make it more difficult for people to challenge incumbents?
Absolutely not. As long as you have a bill like the Anderson bill, which doesn't limit the amount that can be spent, but limits the amount that an individual can contribute. And that way you further broaden the process, further broaden the participation. Because why does a guy want to give $50 when he knows Clement Stone is giving $7 million? What influence is his $50 going to have?
Now, you might say, what makes it clear that a person is more effective at raising funds if he happens to know one man who can give him $1 million while someone else may know 100 who can give 100 each? That problem of access to money, rich people tend to know rich people. Would you say that's a fair statement?
I think that's correct. And those who aren't rich tend to move towards people who have ideas that can raise a lot of money.
And in the present atmosphere, would you say that with Watergate that we're reacting hysterically to this problem, or
make this very brief?
I don't think so at all. I think this is the single most important issue that can be resolved by this Congress.
All right, let's go to Mr. Bordeaux. I think he's eager to ask you some questions.
Senator, I noticed you said that it was degrading to go out and raise money. Does this mean that you are not in favor of the Anderson bill, which does permit contributions up to $1,000?
No, it doesn't. I think it's degrading to have to go out and know that that is your only source of money. When the man you're talking to, for example, knows that, in fact, he's the only means by which you can even begin to run for office.
But are you in favor of the Anderson bill?
Yes, I am in favor of the Anderson bill.
All right. Now let me ask you this question. The Anderson bill provides a $1,000 limitation on contributions. Are you saying that going out and asking for $1,500 is degrading?
No, I think you missed the point, or else I haven't made the point properly. If in fact you know that the only way you can raise any money to get to run for public office is to go to vested interest groups, then in fact you're put in the position that you have to begin to wonder whether or not you prostitute the ideas that you have about government in order to get the money to begin to run.
Of course, you've had recent experience with this, having been elected in 1972.
That's correct.
And I believe you just said that your campaign cost some $300,000.
$276,000.
All right, so and you raised that money by public contributions, did you not?
That's correct.
And you raised that money in a race against an incumbent, did you not?
That's correct.
Yes. And Senator, I'm sure that you would agree that your service in the Senate up to this point has not reflected any particular concern for the larger contributors.
Well, the fortunate thing is I didn't have many larger contributors, and the only reason, I went to the big guys for the money. I was ready to prostitute myself in the manner in which I talked about it,
But what happened was they said, come back when you're 40, son. And so I had to go out.
In the quote, which appears to come from a congressional hearing related to anti-busing legislation, Biden emphasized wanting to ensure we do not have orderly integration of society. That we do have orderly integration of society, adding he was not just talking about education, but all of society. He then said, unless we do something about this, my children are going to grow up in a jungle. The jungle being a racial jungle with tensions having built so high that it's going to explode at some point. We have got to make some moves on this. In comments reported in the Times story, Biden further worried that court-ordered busing would lead to a race war, engendered resentment among both white and black students. You take people who aren't racist, people who are good citizens who believed in equal education and opportunity, and you stunt their children's intellectual growth by busing them to an inferior school, or you're going to fill them with hatred. He said of the busing plan that would bus white students from the suburbs to urban schools. He extended his comments to a hypothetical black student from Wilmington, Delaware, too, wondering, you send him to Alexis I. DuPont, bus him through Centerville every day, then send him back to the ghetto. How can he be encouraged to love his white brothers? The NAACP called Biden's proposal as an anti-black amendment. The senator's sole African-American member, Ed Brooke, called it the greatest symbolic defeat for civil rights since 1964. But Biden helped his fellow liberals reconcile themselves to the wrong side of history by recasting integrationists as the real racists. The new integration plan offered are really just quota system to assure a certain number of blacks, Chicanos, or whatever in each school. That, to me, is the most racist concept you can come up with, Biden said in 1975. The Post also went on to quote Biden saying, in order for your child with curly black hair, brown eyes, and dark skin to be able to learn anything, he needs to sit with my blonde-haired, blue-eyed son, end quote. Biden supported busing. Biden was anti-busing, and Biden fought against the integrationists who were fighting segregation. Keep that in mind.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter, or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I want to ask, what made them do this? They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets.
that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society. And the truth is, we don't very well know how to rehabilitate them at that point. That's the sad truth. I'm the guy that said, rehabilitation, when it occurs, we don't understand it and notice it. And even when we notice it and we know it occurs, we don't know why. So you cannot make rehabilitation a condition for release. That's why in our system, there's the federal system, you serve 85% of your time. It's a shame, but we don't know how to rehabilitate. But there is a consensus, and I will cease. A, we must make the streets safer. I don't care why someone is a malefactor in society. I don't care why someone is antisocial. I don't care why they become a sociopath. We have an obligation to cordon them off from the rest of society, try to help them, try to change the behavior. That's why we do in this bill. We have drug treatment and we have other treatments to try to deal with it. But they are in jail, away from my mother, your husband, our families. But we would be absolutely stupid as a society if we didn't recognize the condition that nurtured those folks still exist. And we must deal with that.
Let's move on to some domestic issues. The country is waking up this morning to the news that the federal government's about to move in on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Those are quasi-government agencies holding $5.3 trillion in mortgage debt. They're in serious trouble at the moment. They're in a free fall, in effect. The government will reorganize them. It appears that they're going to pump in some fresh capital on a quarterly basis. But shareholders will have their shares greatly diluted by this move. But the preferred shareholders, China and other foreign governments that have invested in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, will not suffer because the government will prop them up. Is that fair?
Well, no, it's not fair, but I don't think that's what's going to happen. I talked to Secretary Paulson last night. I'm not at liberty to lay out what he told me because he should announce it today. But there's three principles that have to play here for this to work, in my view. One, you have to make sure that you help homeowners and stabilize at the same time financial institutions. Secondly, you got to make sure that you're not bailing out shareholders versus the taxpayers. And the third thing you got to do is make sure that they're still in a position to be able to continue to lend, because there is a need for them to continue to have this elasticity of being able to deal with the market. Now, what I've heard the outline of, I want to wait till I see all the detail. But if it meets those three principles, then I think it has a great chance of succeeding. As I understand it, whatever proposal Secretary Paulson is going to make is a proposal to get us over this hump of instability and uncertainty. It's not an official reorganization. It will be left to the next administration and the Congress to make those judgments.
All investors suffer equally.
They should. They should. We'll see what the plan is.
In your hometown newspaper this morning, this big headline, Banking on Biden. As a senator, Delaware's financial institutions find themselves banking on Biden. To some, Joe Biden's image makeover as a blue-collar warrior is slightly at odds with the blue blood company that he keeps in the corporate state. Not only is Biden a neighbor to wealthy and powerful company titans and DuPont family members, he's thrown his weight behind issues and legislation that benefited Delaware's big banking interests. This is what the Wall Street Journal had to say about all of this. Obama's choice of Biden as his running mate is coming under fire from Republicans who are painting him as an old-style insider. They cite his long-standing ties to trial lawyers and lobbyists and a taste for pork barrel spending. Biden has collected $6.5 million in campaign contributions from lobbyists, lawyers, and law firms since 1989, according to the Nonpartisan Center for Responsive Politics. Biden's candidacy also is bringing new scrutiny to his family's business dealings, especially those of his son Hunter, who is 38 years old. And that's a reference to your son being hired right out of law school by a big company here in Delaware that is in the credit card business, MBNA. He got about $100,000 a year, as I recall. You received $214,000 in campaign contributions from the company and from its employees. At the same time, you were fighting for a bankruptcy bill that MBNA really wanted to get passed through the Senate, making it much tougher for everyone to file bankruptcy. Senator Obama was opposed to the bill. Among other things, you couldn't, in fact, claim that you had a problem because of big medical bills. You voted against an amendment that would call for a warning on predatory lending. You also called for, you opposed efforts to strengthen the protection of people in bankruptcy. This has been an issue that you've heard about before. Your son was working for the company at the same time. In retrospect, wasn't it inappropriate for someone like you in the middle of all this to have your son collecting money from this big credit card company while you were on the floor protecting its interests?
Absolutely not. My son
for the White House in 2020 has been fending off allegations of sexual misconduct. That swirl of negative press has taken attention away from another potentially damaging revelation. Ukraine's former top prosecutor, speaking to political website The Hill, accuses Biden of pressuring Kiev into sacking him. Caleb Morgan digs deeper.
Former Vice President Joe Biden is caught up in a bit of a scandal. His name has been floated for the last year or so as a possible Democratic challenger to Donald Trump in the 2020 elections. But now everyone is talking about his habit of getting frisky with both women and girls in public.
He leans down, smells my hair, and then plants this big, long kiss on the top of my head.
Joe Biden's presidential campaign hasn't even officially begun, and people are trying to knock him out of the running.
Joe Biden is facing new accusations of inappropriate behavior.
Joe has a habit of doing things right out in the open, and while everyone is focusing on this rather touchy subject, some of his earlier deeds are not getting as much attention. Last year, in an interview, Joe bragged about getting Ukraine's general prosecutor fired. He says he was standing up to corruption.
I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid at the time.
Well, it just so happens that the general prosecutor was investigating an energy firm in which Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was heavily invested. Burisma Holdings is an energy corporation in Ukraine, and Hunter Biden, the son of the former vice president, has made a rather handsome profit from it, especially in the aftermath of the 2014 events in Ukraine, in which pro-EU forces took power. That prosecutor was looking into 3 different instances of foul play from Hunter's cash cow. However, all it took was a phone call from Papa Joe, and that prosecutor was out.
We had plans that included interrogations and other crime investigation procedures into all members of the executive board, including Hunter Biden.
Members of the board obtained funds as well as another US-based legal entity, Rosemont Seneca Partners, LLC, for consulting services.
One might argue that perhaps Joe Biden had no idea about his son's financial interests. They say he's the vice president. Perhaps he was too busy running the country to pay attention to his son's finances. However, if he watched any American media, he couldn't have missed it. Back during the Ukraine events of 2014, the White House dismissed any notion that Hunter Biden's financial dealings had any impact on their decisions.
I'm wondering if the State Department has any concerns or any thoughts about the Vice President's son joining the board of directors of this Ukrainian gas company.
No, he's a private citizen.
So, as reels and reels of video show that Joe Biden has some pretty strange proclivities, and more women come forward saying they do not appreciate his affection, at this point it's pretty clear that Joe has some even stranger skeletons in his closet that he would like to keep buried.
Countries in the hemisphere, and because of a corrupt system that exists in Mexico, there is the 1% of the population at the top, a very small middle class, and the rest is abject poverty. Folks,
those Democrats, and some of you will like it. I voted for 700-mile fence. But let me tell you, we can build a fence 40 stories high, unless it changes the dynamic in Mexico. And you will not like this. And punish American employers who knowingly violate the law when in fact they hire illegals. Unless you do those two things, all the rest is window dressing. Now, I know I'm not supposed to say it that bluntly, but they're the facts. They're the facts. And so everything else we do is in between here. Everything else we do is at the margin. The reason why I believe the fence is needed is not related to immigration as much as it's drugs. I'm the guy that wrote the National Crime Bill. I'm the guy that wrote the National Drug Act. I'm the guy that wrote the law that set up a drug czar. But let me tell you something, folks. People are driving across that border with tons, hear me, tons of everything from byproducts for methamphetamine to cocaine to heroin. It's all coming up through corrupt Mexico. So I would have, as they say in the southern part of my state, I have an altar call with those boys. I have a little Lord meeting. You think I'm joking? I'm not joking. Anything you know about me. I've been doing this a long time. I've known every single major world leader in every country for the past 20 years. And I know a lot of them well. You can pick them up on you guys in the business. I've been a senator, only 4 senators straight while I'm in the history of the United States Senate. A lot of the line, folks, is we got to know with these folks. Don't tell me in Mexico you expect to get the same kind of treatment that we give other democracies, and then you don't act in a democratic way. Not on my watch. Not on my watch. Yes, sir. Unless we do something